be your teacher for Sports Betting Simplified, expert strategies to help you win serious cash. I've been a sports bettor for the better part of 12 years now, and I actually started when I was in college. During the first year that I played, I was able to pay for my entire college tuition with my winnings based on simply NFL sports betting throughout that year. It's a great way to use your knowledge of sports to help you win serious cash, and I'm going to be here to teach you how to do it. I wanted to set up this short video in order to show you a little bit about what you're going to learn in this course. Video Series 1 is going to explain the whole process of sports betting. We're going to talk about the different types of bets you can make, both in Las Vegas and online, and different betting strategies that gamblers use that are very basic. In other words, what's a unit and what's a spread and an over-under and things like that. After watching the first video series, you should be confident enough to walk into any sports book at any casino anywhere in the world and have a very good idea of what you're doing and how you make bets and how you would win a bet. Video series number 2 is going to talk about the research that every sports handicapper needs to make in order to be particularly good. So we're going to talk about different things like trends and how the public and the sharps, who they are and how are they going to affect the way that odds are made and calculated. Video Series 3 is about expert betting strategies and how to maximize cash investments if you decide to open up a sports betting account. So I hope you'll join me for this and more in our Sports Betting Simplified course. Let's start off this video series by talking about the absolute basics of sports betting. We're going to simplify all of this so that you understand every aspect of sports betting over the course of these next couple videos in the first video series. In this video, I want to talk about terminology, spread betting, and over-under bets. Before we delve into the actual process of betting on sports, we need to understand a little bit about terminology first. So I started with units. Now whenever you look online and see professional handicappers talking about their picks, they're going to talk about them in terms of units. A simple way to define units is 1/100th of the total investment you plan on making. So it's 1% of your annual gambling budget that you've set aside for sports betting. So we'll talk about how you can play with units later on, but a unit is a very common terminology. It just means a small portion of the investment that you're making in sports betting over the course of a year. Vigorish, or sometimes it's just called the VIG, is a bookie's take from the overall profit. So the way Vigorish is usually represented is it's an extra 10% on top of your bet that you have to pay for the privilege of making a bet. Now this is how bookies make the majority of their money, is through the Vigorish. So in other words, you will bet $110 to make a $100 bet. The $10 extra that you're paying is the Vigorish, and that's what the bookie is taking home as his profit from the overall betting pool. The spread is the point differential that's got to be overcome in order for you to have a winning bet. So we're going to look at an example of this as we talk about spread betting. There are 6 types of bets that you need to know when we're talking about sports betting. The first 4 I'm going to cover in this video because they're all very straightforward. You have spread betting, over-under betting, player bets, and you also have what is called the straight-up bet. You can also play parlays and teasers, which we will be talking about in a future video. What I put on this slide was an example of what you would see as a common type of bet that you would make in sports betting. It's called a spread bet. This is the most common, most typical type of sports betting. The first line says Minnesota at Green Bay minus 9.5. The second line is Minnesota plus 9.5 at Green Bay. These actually read the same. Now the idea behind a spread bet is that the team Green Bay is favored by 9.5 points. So if you were to bet on Green Bay in this game, they would have to win by 10 or more points in order for you to be the winner. Now if you wanted to go the other way and bet on Minnesota, Minnesota would get 9.5 extra points added to their point total at the end of the game while playing against Green Bay. So this is what we're talking about with the spread. That 9.5 points is the amount of points that need to be overcome in order for your team to win. It's not a straight up bet. What you have here is the over-under for that same Minnesota-Green Bay game. The over-under for this game was set at 50.5 points. And in an over-under game, you're betting on the total number of points scored by both teams. So if Minnesota and Green Bay combine their scores and have a total of 51 points or higher, you would win with an over, while you would win with an under if they got 50 or fewer points. And it's a combined score, it's not just one team. Here you see money line odds for the same Minnesota-Green Bay game. Now, as we saw in this hypothetical game, Green Bay is favored by 9.5 points to win. So the money line bets, you're betting directly on the team to win. You're not including any of that spread data. So if Green Bay wins the game by 1 point, you'd still win if you have money line on Green Bay. Money line is a great way to bet, but it is, of course, a way for the sports books to punish you for betting on heavy favorites like Green Bay is in this game. The minus 380 next to Green Bay means that you need to invest $380 on Green Bay in order to win a profit of $100. Now, if you do that, if you bet $380 on Green Bay, you won't just get $100 back. You don't automatically lose. You will receive $100 plus the original $380 that you received back, so you'll receive $480. Minnesota plus 300 means that if you bet Minnesota on the money line straight up to win, you will receive $400 back. That would be your original $100 you invested in the bet and the $300 that you will win for having a winning bet on Minnesota. So money line is a great way to make a lot of profit, especially if you're betting on heavy underdogs. So here's the hypothetical result from this game. Let's take a look at what would happen if Minnesota scored 35 points and Green Bay scored 42. If you remember, Green Bay was favored by 9.5 points to win this game. In fact, they only won by 7. That would be the difference between 35 and 42. So since they did not cover their 9.5 point spread, if you were doing a spread bet, you would have won had you bet on Minnesota, and you would have lost had you bet on Green Bay. The over-under was set at 50.5 points. So in this case, the winner is the over bet, because altogether they scored 77 points, far exceeding the 50.5 that was set at the over-under. If you were to have done a straight bet, however, you would have won at Green Bay, because Green Bay did at the end win the game. So those are the three basic types of bets and how the results would have come out had you done those bets. The final type of bet that I want to talk about in this video is the individual player bet. So I have here an Alshon Jeffrey bet that could potentially have been offered in a certain week. The bet would be that Alshon Jeffrey will exceed 100 yards in receiving in any game. Now, some places will do receiving yards, some places will do total yards, and this is an over-under. So if Alshon Jeffrey exceeds 100 rushing yards or 100 receiving yards or some combination of both, you would win this bet. And if not, then you would lose this bet. This is kind of an atypical bet that's usually only offered in situations where players have the potential to break records, or during Super Bowl week, you'll see a lot of individual player bets. It's a great way to make some extra money. In this video, I want to discuss the two other types of sports bets that are available to you. Those are called parlays and teaser bets. Both parlay and teaser bets are multi-team bets. And what that means is that you're picking more than one situation to occur. Maybe across multiple games, maybe across multiple sports, or maybe even in the same game if you were to do a spread bet, a money line bet, and an over-under in the same game. Now, multi-team bets are significantly more difficult to win. However, they offer the player a huge advantage in terms of being able to do what you want and in terms of giving you big potential profits. So both of these share a lot of things, as you can see on the chart here. They both involve you choosing multiple winning teams or doing multiple over-under bets. In a parlay, the odds are coming directly from the sportsbook, meaning that you don't have any ability to change the odds whatsoever. With teasers, your odds are changed based on your preference. In both cases, you win only if all individual bets win. And while the teasers will give you an additional bonus for making a multi-team play, parlays will win you a lot of money, and it adds up very quickly, which we will see on the payoff slides. As I just mentioned, with parlays, the odds are coming directly from the sports book. With teasers, you get to change and control a little bit of the odds. Most sports books will allow you to tease the odds 3, 6, 7, or 10 points in your favor. There are even a few out there that will let you do 14-point teasers. Now, the big advantage to the parlay is the amount of money that you're going to win. If you pick 3, 4, or even 5 bets correctly, you're getting 20 or 30 to 1 odds, which is just outstanding on sports betting, as you're typically going to get less than 1 to 1 odds on picking a winning team. So parlays are a way to get a lot of money very quickly, even on small bets. With a teaser, you're going to win less money. Now, you might even just win, it's approximately $10 per bet that you add on to your team. But even still, if you do a 9-play teaser where you bet on 9 different outcomes with the odds changed to be in your favor, you might win $100 on a $10 bet. It depends on how many points you want to tease. So let's take a look at that a little bit more in detail. Here's what I'm talking about with parlays and teasers in terms of payoffs. If you do a 5-team parlay, that is, you pick 9 teams to beat the spread, and you get all 5 teams to actually do this, you can combine with money lines or over-unders. You'll receive $200 for every $10 you invest. And that's only with 5 teams. 20 to 1 odds is very good odds. If you were to do an 8-team parlay, that is, you pick 8 results correctly, you'll receive $1,500 for every $10 you invest. So just think about the potential here and what you could be earning if you were to have a successful parlay. With teasers, it's a little bit different. With teasers, you're winning significantly less money. If you do a 7-point teaser with 9 chosen results, you would earn $100 for every $10 you invest. It doesn't sound great, but remember, these are cases in which the odds are greatly changed in your favor. If you were to have bet in the hypothetical Green Bay versus Minnesota game, you could have had Minnesota at plus 16.5. They were 9.5. You're getting 7 points in your favor, which means that at the end of the game, you're adding 16.5 points to Minnesota's point total. Even the worst teams in the league should be able to cover 16 points in any given day on a football field. So with teasers, the odds are greatly enhanced in your favor. You'll still need multiple wins in order to make it worthwhile. But even still, a 5-team 6-point teaser, you'd win $45 for every $10 you invest. And that's pretty good as well. Let's finish up this video series with a talk about strategy. This is very basic beginning level sports betting strategy for anybody who wants to get involved in the sport. The idea behind sports betting is that you're playing for an entire season. You're not playing for just 1 week or just one game. So before the season even starts, you want to take your total investment, deposit it into your sports book, or keep it in some sort of different bank account if you're using a regular casino. And you want to break it up into units that are small enough that you can make 100 of them just from your starting cash pool. You can always edit it later, but you want to make sure that you have 100 units to start with so that you're not investing all of your units in a single week or a single game. Every single week or every single series of games, my background is in football, NFL football. So I always talk about things in terms of weeks. But you never want to invest more than 30% of your total money into straight bets in any given week. So that would be 30 units or less that you're spending every week. You can put 20 units on one game if you want, although most sports bettors will put only 1 to 5 units on any given game. But you never want to spend more than 30% of your total money in a given week. If you have a bad week, your entire cash flow could be gone, and that would be a shame. I always recommend to new players in particular that you want to invest 1/10 of a unit per week into either a teaser play or a parlay, meaning that 1/10 of a unit would be after 10 weeks you've spent 1 unit on these. These are low probability bets. Like a parlay is very, very difficult to win. However, if you win one, even with only 1/10 of a unit, you're getting 150 to 1 odds or 20 to 1 odds on a sports bet, and that can literally save your entire week or send you into a tremendous profit for a week just with 1/10 of a unit bet on that game. With all this talk about odds in terms of parlays and teaser bets, it's also important to understand the basic odds of spread bets, over-unders, and player bets. All of those bets are usually considered to be minus 110, which means that you invest $110 for the chance to win $100. That extra $10 that you're spending to not win is called the vigorish, which we discussed in the last video. That's the bookies' take if they get even action on both sides of the wager. So on a spread bet or on an over-under or on a player bet, you're paying $110 to win $100. You're actually going to receive back $210. You will get your original $110 plus the $100 that you win. Parlays and teasers are considered to be minus 100, which is even money bets. You bet 100, you win 100. Now, of course, those are there's no vigorish on those because the odds of somebody winning them are so much lower than a spread bet. One last word about odds making and vigorish before we end this video series, and that's going to be called the bookie's dilemma. The goal when setting up spread betting and over-under betting is in order to get even money on both sides of the wager, meaning that in our hypothetical Minnesota-Green Bay game, an equal number of people would decide that Green Bay is going to cover the 9.5 point spread, while others are saying that Minnesota will cover the 9.5 point spread. This is ideal for bookies because then they're making pure profit no matter who wins the game. They get to keep all of that vigorish. However, in actuality, they're also going to be winning and losing money based on which teams win and lose. There's absolutely no way for them to guarantee that even amounts of money will be bet on both Green Bay and Minnesota. What's going to inevitably happen is regardless of which team is favored, more money will be spent on one team than the other. The bookie will then have to pay out all of that money to the winners, and they could end up actually losing a significant portion of their vigorish or of their own personal stash of money if the wrong team wins for them. What bookies do in order to change this is they change the vigorish. If there is a game in which both sides are seeing equal amounts of money being bet on them, vigorish is less important because it's going to be a minus 110 no matter where you go, and bookies will be happy to take that and go. In a game where there's a lopsided amount of money being spent on one or more teams or one or more types of bets, like let's say there's significantly more money on Green Bay and the over, bookies will change the vigorish so that if you want to bet on Green Bay, you'll end up paying minus 120 in vigorish, and you'll end up paying minus 100 in vigorish on the Vikings because they're receiving less action. So you'll get even money odds on the Vikings, and you'll get slightly worse odds on the Packers in order to entice people to bet more money on the Vikings. So this is the bookie's dilemma, and it describes how vigorish is applied to basic bets. Before we move on to some of the finer points of betting on actual sports, I wanted to mention the side bets available for non-sports betting, which is actually a really easy way to make some money if you have an interest in some of the things that are non-sports related. There are three main opportunities for doing non-sports betting, and your expertise in this area or in these multiple areas is just such a really profound way to make money. You know, sports books have existed for years and years and years, and as a way to try to increase their business, they're starting to offer. This is the last of the tutorial videos on how sports betting works. After this, we're going to get into how to analyze teams or players, and then talk about some basic betting strategies. So I wanted to create this video to review everything we've learned about sports betting so far. I broke this down video by video. So in video 1, you learned the basic definition of units, vigorish, and spreads. These are going to be three of the most common terms in all of sports betting and things that you must know if you plan on being a sports bettor. We also talked about the basics of spread betting, that would be your plus and your minus points. We talked about over-unders, straight bets, which are also called money line bets, and bets on individual players, most frequently offered during the Super Bowl. We also talked about basic gambling and basic money management strategy as you start your sports betting career. In video 2, we talked about all of the multi-team wagers that were available to you as a sports bettor. So we talked about parlays and teasers and how they work, how you can bet multiple teams and increase your odds on winning big time money, up to 200 to 1 sometimes. We talked about the strategy of how we want to play these and how I always recommend playing at least one $10 wager every week on either a parlay or a teaser. And then we discussed how odds are sometimes calculated for these, and we had a discussion of payoffs. And that's really the reason why you want to try to include one every week. Video 3 was a really quick video. It was to discuss non-sports betting. It works just the same way as sports betting does. It's just got a few options that are just kind of outside the norm. And I discussed in this video how I think it's one of the easiest and safest ways to make money, and I thought that it was a really good opportunity if you're already invested in a field like politics or wrestling or reality television. So what's next? Well, our next video series is going to talk about research and how different factors affect sports betting that are going to help you choose the right side to wager on. We're going to talk about trends, and we're going to go really in-depth into trends and how they work. We're going to talk about public teams, and we're going to talk about how the sharps like to bet as well. So these are kind of three of the most important elements of sports betting, because as a non-sports bettor, you think you know the NFL, but sports bettors really, really know the NFL. And it works the same way for every sport. As I've said, my background is in football, so I like to think about things in terms of weeks and football. But it works the same way for baseball strategy. You know, baseball fans might know who's going to win, but a baseball bettor is going to know who's going to win and by how much. And it's going to all be based on trends and the public and the sharps. So let's get into that in the second video series. Welcome to video series number 2. In this video series, we're going to talk about who you want to bet on. After watching video series 1, you should have a good idea of how to bet and what kinds of bets are appropriate for you. Now we're going to talk about how to choose the winning team. You might think you know your sport, but you don't know your sport as well as a sports bettor needs to, unless you're able to follow the trends, the sharps, and the public. Let's start with trends. Here are three basic acronyms you need to know when you're talking about trends. Trends are usually spelled out using these acronyms. ATS stands for against the spread. Typically when you see this kind of trend, you will see something along the lines of, the Bears are 4-0 ATS. That means against the spread. And then they'll follow that up with a condition. So in the last 4 games, or when Matt Forte rushes for 500 yards, or whatever it is. So ATS, against the spread. Straight up. Straight up is a as if you had placed a money line wager. So it means they won the game. It does not necessarily mean that they covered the spread in that game. So it's considered a weaker trend than against the spread, but it is considered a important thing because a lot of important trends can come from this. HTH is head to head. So when you have HTH trends, you're looking at one team versus another team, and it's only that one team. So it's a good way to do things in a matchup-based scenario, which is great for teams that have played each other many times. So what do trends look like? I chose some of these trends from one of the more recent weeks in NFL football. This is what a trend will look like. These are all over-under trends. It says the under is 4-0 in the Bills' last 4 games overall. That's a very strong trend that the under might be a good bet for this current upcoming Bills game. However, the over is 5-0 in the Bills' last 5 games in October. Slightly less important because the games in October from previous years, might not have any bearing on how the team is this year. You have to kind of analyze whether or not that one is really important or not. Going slightly less important, the over is 4-0 in the Bills' last 4 games in Week 5. So there's something about Week 5 that makes them a good team. But what is it? Is it important to you? I'm not really sure. The other important trend is, well, actually the least important of the trends is like this last one. This last one says the under is 4-1 in Bills' last 5 games after allowing less than 90 rushing yards in their previous game. So trends are usually found by computers, and computers will stretch their imagination to figure out more and more and more trends. So is this an important trend? Probably not. Because who cares what happens if you allowed less than 90 yards in their previous game, how that is going to affect their current game. So trends have an order of importance to them. And the strong trends, like the last 5 games overall, or the last 20 games overall, or whatever it is, those ones are really important. And some trends, like that bottom one, are just not important at all. It's up to you as a player to decide the level of importance that they have. As I said, trends are usually created by computers. So what is the value of a trend? Well, trends are analysis that's really fundamentally sound. And what I like about this is we're not comparing 2 or more teams when we're talking about this. We're not saying, okay, the Seattle Seahawks have the best defense in the league compared to everybody else. What we're analyzing is the Seahawks against themselves. How good are they really, based on these trends? And I think that that's a really important thing to know, because if everybody else's defense is terrible, your defense could be just slightly less terrible and it would still be number one. So these are really, really important things that give you fundamentally sound analysis that's not based on hearsay or on qualitative data. It's all based on quantitative data, which is usually the strongest. Trends give you historical data that plots a team's ability, and it's usually historical data that is not something that you remember right off the top of your head. Maybe you know some anecdotes that will tell you this data, but this is historical data that plots a team's ability to play against itself, usually. The other thing is that trends will analyze a team's ability across many different dimensions of play. So you'll see trends that say things like the last trend on the previous page, something about rushing yards in previous games or in past games, and how that might affect the current game. Well, if you say, okay, based on some of these other trends, I feel like my opponent's going to have very few rushing yards. How is that going to help me win this game? What is going to be the trend that I want that's going to show me what will happen? So it allows you to analyze many different dimensions of play, and far more than you would analyze if you were just to sit back and say, okay, who is the better team? Who is the better offense? Who is the better defense? Who is the better quarterback? And then choosing based on that. Trends give you a lot more in-depth. This gives you an idea of what some of the best trends might be. So some of the best trends that I've seen are the player-specific trends. And I love these player-specific trends when we're talking about players who are really, really awesome. Those future Hall of Fame guys. So if I see a trend about how Tom Brady rarely loses 2 games against the spread in a row, if he's just coming off of an against the spread loss, I feel pretty confident that he's going to win against the spread this next time. Now, unfortunately, there's very few player-specific trends that you want to use because there's very few players who you should feel confident enough in to make that trend worthwhile. For instance, if we had said the same thing about a guy like Austin Davis, who, Austin Davis is a decent quarterback. I'm sure he's a nice guy. He's not going to be a Hall of Fame quarterback. And that means that a trend based on Austin Davis's performance is probably not really a worthwhile trend to follow. But those ones that are about team leaders and coaches in particular are very good. Some of the other best trends are about stadiums and weather and field conditions. These have to do with the environment that the game is played in. So if you're in Quest Field in Seattle, the Seahawks have very good against the spread records there because their stadium is such a unique environment. There's also a strong dichotomy between teams that are good at home and teams that are good on the road. So trends related to that are very important. You also want to think about return games after a loss. This kind of goes with my player-specific trends that I was mentioning before. After a loss, how does a team bounce back? Certain players will almost always bounce back really strong. Other teams might not. So those are important to think about. And then also, particularly in divisional games, HTH spreads, or HTH trends, I should say, are very important. HTH is head-to-head. So when two teams face each other frequently, what are the historical implications of that? I just found a trend the other day that said that Tom Brady was 22-2 against the Buffalo Bills in his career, head straight up. So in that kind of a situation, you'd be almost a fool not to bet on New England to win a money line bet there. Now the odds weren't great because the Buffalo Bills are still not a very good team, at least at the time of this recording. But the final score ended up being something like 37-22. So players who took the Patriots against the spread or straight up in a money line wager would have won a lot of money on that. And that's just such a strong trend that it's hard to vote against it. Let's talk about some of the worst trends. My least favorite trend is typically a trend that's going to be based on rushing and passing yards. I talked about it before when we saw that Bills rushing yards in under 90 rushing yards in previous games, and I'm sure that trend does exist, and I'm sure it has value to somebody, but I'm not the kind of guy who puts a lot of stock into that. Even if I know that a team has a good chance of having a lot of rushing yards, sometimes they don't. Sometimes coaches just forget to use their star rusher, or they think too hard about using that guy, and then they don't do it when it comes time for game day because they figure that the defense will plan against it. Heck, sometimes the defense is able to game plan against a specific player and stop them from having any effect. We've seen that a couple dozen times. Maybe the team gets so far behind that they can't run the ball anymore. They must pass. And then all of a sudden your trend is worthless because you're not getting the rushing or passing yards that you need to get. I dislike using this trend and I almost never use it. I also dislike trends based on poor players. So, as I said in the previous video, I think that player trends are really, really important on players who are, top of the line, future Hall of Fame players. I limit my player trends to maybe 10 guys who I think are for sure going to be able to produce reliable results every week. And to be honest with you, 10 players is probably too many. I should probably cut down to 5 or 6. But I think that, you have a game where Tom Brady has a trend that shows he's going to do really well. Well, fine. I trust Tom Brady to do a good job. I do not trust most players in that position. So, trends based on poor players, I throw them out the window. I don't pay attention to them, even if they're very strong. The final trend that I dislike using is head-to-head trends of non-divisional teams. And I say this because they're out there, and there's a lot of them that sound really good. There was one that said something along the lines of, the Buffalo Bills have never won at Soldier Field, I think was one of them. And this trend dated back to 1920 or something like that. And, okay, great. That's a wonderful trend to have that the Bills have never won at Soldier Field, but how do the teams of 15 years ago or 80 years ago matter to today's game? So, and that's the kind of thing you get with head-to-head trends of non-divisional teams. The teams don't play each other enough to really matter. You want to go back maybe 1 or 2 years at the most. And for non-divisional teams, that means 1 or 2 games, and you can't create a trend off of just 2 games. So where do you find trends? The website you see on your screen, www.covers.com, is my source for finding all of the latest trends in matchups. Now, I'll tell you right up the front, you have to dig pretty deep on their website to find them, but they're all there. And I think that Covers is a great website to use because it's free, even if you don't register or anything else. And I think that some of their trends there, they do tend to have fewer trends than everybody else, but they also have trends that are kind of more pertinent to the game of football. You can also try to find trends using sports betting software that's available out there, but that can be a lot of money. So, especially if you're first starting out, I would recommend just using covers.com. You have to click into the matchup a couple of times to find the trends, but they will all be listed there. So it's a great source for you to get a lot of trends for free. Our last video in this second video series talked about how to bet based on trends. This video is going to tell you who to bet on based on two different groups of people, the public and the sharps. In order to understand the public and the sharps, you need to have a more thorough understanding about how bookies make money. Ultimately, all bookies are in the business of making money. So let's take a look at a hypothetical situation. We have a game in which the Packers are 9.5 favorites at the Vikings. This shows the ideal situation for a bookie, which is where 50% of the money is bet on the Packers and 50% of the money is bet on the Vikings. Now, in this hypothetical situation, we're going to say $1,100 is bet on each side. No matter what actually happens in this game, no matter who wins, if there's 50% of the money on both sides, the bookie is going to make an easy $200 on the Vigorish. Because remember, 1,000 of that 1,100 is considered to be bet on each side, and the extra $100 on each side is the Vigorish. The bookie will collect the Vigorish, the losers will pay the winners. So the bookie gets money regardless of what happens, and for them, this is considered almost an ideal situation. They want to make money no matter what happens. Alright, this is the same game, but we have a slight difference in the way that the people who are betting on this game have decided to bet. 75% of people have bet on the Packers, while 25% of people have bet on the Vikings. Now, for a bookie, this is either a win or a loss. There's no way for them to come out even, and there's no way for them to win just based on the result of the game. It has to go the way they need it to go. So, we're going to say that for the sake of argument, $2,200 is bet total. Now, that's the same total amount of money as before, but this time it's dispersed differently. In the previous slide, 50-50 was the way it was dispersed, which was $1,100 on each side. In this one, the Vikings have $550, which is $500 bet, $50 Vigorish. The Packers have $1,650, and that's $1,500 bet, $150 in Vigorish. Here's what will happen if you're a bookie. If the Vikings win, the bookies win, because so much money was bet on the Packers that they pay out their money on the Packers to the winners who bet on the Vikings. And then they get $1,200 left over because there was so much excess money bet on the Packers. Bookies get to keep that money. If the Packers win, the bookies are in trouble because all of the money from the Vikings losers gets paid out to the Packers. That satisfies only 25% of the 75% of people who bet on the Packers. So now all of the vigorish that they made on the Vikings also gets paid out to the Packers. And the bookie's going to have to cover the rest of that money out of their own pocket. So if the Packers win, bookies lose $950. This is what some would consider to be an ideal situation for bookies because they have the potential to not just win $200, they have the potential to win $1,200. However, bookies don't like to think like this. Bookies want easy, guaranteed money. They're not in the business of gambling themselves. They're in the business of facilitating gambling for others. So this is not an ideal situation for them. However, it does sometimes result in them winning more money than they normally would have. Further understanding of the public and the sharps has to do with how spreads are calculated. One part of how the spreads are calculated is the actual results that the bookies feel like is going to happen based on football. Because bookies ultimately want even betting 50-50 on all games. And if the bookie gets that number correct, whether it's -3 or -3.5 or -20, whatever it is, the right spread should entice enough people to bet evenly on both sides of the number. However, because we're attempting that, we also happen to know that it's almost never going to happen. So one part of how the spread is calculated is also based on public perception. If this team is really good, really popular, if it's a team like the Dallas Cowboys or the New England Patriots or the Chicago Bears, those are probably the three most popular teams in the entire NFL. And the public is more likely to bet on those teams if they think they're good, and they're more likely to bet against those teams if they think they're bad. So one part public perception has to be thrown into how the spreads are calculated. And that's why spreads, or I'm sorry, not spreads, but money disbursement is almost never actually 50-50 on a game. Now, finally, we can talk about the two types of players. The two types of players are the public and the sharps. The public is the everyman of sports betting, the guy who's a very casual bettor, probably isn't thinking about sports betting as an investment of his money, but he's thinking of it more as a way to, spend a little bit of money, have a hobby, maybe win some money. What you want to do when you're thinking about the public is you want to pay attention to the public perception of a team. Does everybody think they're terrible, or are they actually pretty good? They're just not winning for whatever reason. So these kind of teams have kind of a low public perception. You can make a lot of money betting on those kind of teams where the public perception is low, but they're actually better than people think they are. Here's the thing about playing with the public. If you want to win money, one of the best techniques is to bet against the popular public teams. You can find out what teams the public is high on covers.com. It has a site, or it has an area right in the middle of the page where it will show you the top 5 or 6 teams based on how many people have bet their money on this team. So it'll be like, let's say, San Diego Chargers, 77%. That means that 77% of the money being bet on that game that the San Diego Chargers are in is on the San Diego Chargers. If you take, let's say, the top 5 of those teams and you bet against them in every case, you will probably win money. It's considered a legitimate betting technique, and it's one of the simplest tips I can possibly give you about how to play at least NFL football based on spread betting. It also works for other sports. However, it has a less profound effect in a sport like baseball. Now, the sharps. The sharps are high volume sports bettors, and they have results. So they're going to back up their play with solid results. They often will bet on teams that are not considered good. So, like I said, the public teams are usually not going to be who the sharps are betting on. And what you want to do is you want to watch how sharps play in order to find different opportunities for betting. You don't want to just follow what the sharps do. They're going to win money over the course of a season, but they might lose week to week. So they're looking for those 1 or 2 games where they can make a ton of money. And they're not necessarily going to win all the time. But you can find out who these people are by visiting casino websites. Sometimes they will post the winners and their picks as a way to entice more people to bet along with those people. So when you're betting, you want to be a sharp. You want to bet on the teams that are not necessarily considered good, and you don't want to overreact to what you see in a certain week. So be a sharp, don't be the public, and more importantly, bet against what the public thinks is good. You'll make some money with that. We have one final piece to talk about when we talk about who you want to bet on. This video is all about underdogs and why underdogs are the preferred play in sports betting. The last video really discussed how the public bets. This should give you a little bit more insight into why we like underdogs so much more. The public is going to bet heavily on favored teams, particularly teams that are favored by a large margin. The public also likes to bet on America's team, whoever that is. It's been the Dallas Cowboys, it could be the New England Patriots, it's starting to become the Seattle Seahawks and the Denver Broncos. These are kind of the teams that everybody's sort of into because of either the players on their team or just because that team is really, really good. So the public is usually going to bet on those kind of teams. They're also going to bet on teams following a huge performance. There was a game a couple years ago where Michael Vick had something like 7 touchdowns and 100 rushing yards against the Washington Redskins, back when Michael Vick was part of the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles were overbet in every single game following that big, huge Monday night performance, and they rarely were able to kind of match that level of intensity that they had after that big performance. It's something the public likes to chase. So teams that have things like this are always going to be favored, and that's why we like underdogs. Going back to the previous video, I think it's important to see how the sharps bet as well so that you can kind of further understand what the sharps are going to do. The sharps are going to place bets on quality underdogs. That is, teams that are decent, but that haven't really have the record to show it, or they don't have the kind of players on their team that really, sell jerseys or appear in commercials and things like that. They're just decent teams. The other thing that sharps like to bet on is teams that don't have wins, or teams that have very, very few wins, because those are teams that will kind of surprise you as they do well. So there was a game with the Jacksonville Jaguars and the Pittsburgh Steelers earlier this year. The Steelers were not a great team, and the Jaguars were not a good team, but they were certainly better than advertised, and they had been winless at this point. You can bet on the Jaguars to cover in a situation like this, and they can do it because the spread was favored in Pittsburgh's favor. So Pittsburgh won, I think, by 3 points, and the spread was something like 7. So these are the kind of teams that the sharps like to focus on. Decent, underachieving underdogs. Maybe you don't like the idea of the public and the sharps. So here are some more advantages to underdogs. We've already talked about how these are teams that the public tends to avoid. But the major advantages to underdogs are that they don't have to win the game in order to win against the spread. They just have to be competitive. So if your team is, a 3-point underdog, they can lose by 2, they can lose by 1, and you'll still win. If they lose by a field goal, well, then you get a push, which is you get your money back, essentially. But these teams don't have to win straight up. They just have to be relatively competitive. There's also a certain amount of parity in the NFL. Teams that were great this year are not great the next year, and so on and so forth. And this is perfectly shown by Super Bowl winning teams. There hasn't been a repeating Super Bowl winning team in a very long time. So every team is able to be competitive against every other team, at least in the NFL. There are other sports where this is true too, but there's no other sport like the NFL where it's this way. Now the other advantage to underdogs is let's say the favored team is winning by 1 or 2. That's just as good to them because it doesn't count as far as them winning against the spread. They just have to win straight up. So those teams might get ahead by 1 and then get to the goal line and then kneel for a victory. So the way actual sports people play is they play to win the game, not to win against the spread. It's a huge advantage that they have over a favored team that has to win by 7 or has to win by 6 or whatever it is. Winning by 1 is just as valid for those teams. Welcome to Video Series 3, the final video series in Sports Betting Simplified. In this video and in the following videos, we're going to talk about betting strategies. In this first video, I want to give you some of the basics, review what we've learned so far, and then in the subsequent videos, we'll talk about advanced betting strategies that will help you keep money in your pocket. Let's have an overview first of what we've already learned about betting strategies from previous videos. By now you should have an idea what your initial investment is. That initial investment should be broken up into 100 equal parts. These are called units. You need to have 100 units because you need to be able to recover from a bad weekend. It happens to everybody. You should have your accounts created wherever it is that you plan on doing the majority of your sports betting. Certain sports books in casinos will allow you to maintain a tab there. You can actually deposit your overall investment into the tab there, the account that you have at that casino. Now, online websites also have a very complicated deposit system. So if you're not in the US and you are allowed to do online gambling, you need to make sure that your account is created way ahead of time because you don't want to rush to get your plays in. The way that your money is deposited is through a ACH deposit, and what that means is that it takes the same amount of time that a check takes to clear, unless you're doing something along the lines of a PayPal or an instant credit. So it is much to your advantage to get your account set up very much ahead of time so that you have all of your units available in there. Now, the final tip that I've talked about before is that you should invest no more than 30% of your total units into betting in any one week. So this is what will allow you to kind of limit your play and not to go crazy, and also to make sure that you have money available for the entire season. You can have a bad week. You can have 2 or 3 bad weeks, but you can always recover by the end as long as you have units left to bet. If you try chasing money after a bad week and try to invest all of your money into 2 or 3 games, and those 2 or 3 games go poorly for you, then you're out for the season. Or you have to reinvest more money, which is almost never a good idea. The best gamblers start with their initial investment and walk away if it's gone. One of my major pieces of information for you is that you want to be the sharp. So if you're thinking about being the sharp, the guy who wins a majority of the time and whose plays are going to be so solid that you can't go wrong, you have to think about how you play differently than you would play as an amateur bettor. And even though you might be an amateur sports bettor, you have to kind of play as if you were a sharp. So here's what amateurs do. Amateurs bet every game, or if not every game, at least most of the games out there. The sharp is going to pick every game, but the sharp is not actually going to put money down on every game. They're going to play maybe 3 to 7 games every week, and that's out of a total of, let's say, 16 games. So you're playing around 25% of the games. The amateur is going to play mostly favorites. They're also going to play a few high-value money lines, meaning games where you can win, let's say, $300 on a $100 investment. And they're also going to play home teams or their favorite teams or whatever. The sharp is going to play mostly underdogs. They're also going to play a lot of low-value money lines, the lines that are minus 250, where you have to bet $250 to win $100. So sharps like those because they're basically guaranteed wins. Their favorite team is the one they have the most units on. You see these guys walk into sports books all the time, and you see amateurs walk in all the time. The sharps are dressed generically. The amateurs have their favorite team jersey on, and they got their Cam Newton jersey on, and they bet $500 to win on Carolina against the spread.
The best of everything is even better during Red Lobster's Ultimate Seafood Celebration, where new seafood combinations like the new Grand Seafood Feast are stepped up, spiffed up, jazzed up. Yeah, this stuffed lobster tail,
this is an example
brown
of a
butter
good
scampi,
betting
and
strategy.
jumbo hand-battered shrimp
The
aren't
only
that
plays
good.
you want to bet
Or try the new
are
Ultimate Wood
over-unders,
Grill
spreads,
that
and
bourbon
money
brown
lines.
sugar glaze
These
gets
are
you
probably
fired
the
up.
3
With new
most
dishes like
basic
these,
types of
why
bets.
wait to
And
celebrate?
they're the best
But just like
types
this
of
time of
bets
year,
to
this
make
is too
because
good to
these are the
last.
ones you can
So hurry
actually
in.
analyze. There are different types of bets available where you can bet on quarters, what happens in an individual quarter, what happens in an individual half of football, and what happens with individual players. These are not good bets. These are the kind of bets that people make when they know they're going to lose their against the spread bet and they want to try to recoup some of their money. And these are bets that have a very low chance of success, and they're the kind of bets that I think they're meant for players who are not particularly good. There's not a lot of analysis you can do that's going to tell you who's going to win in the first quarter. And even if there is, that might be a point of emphasis for that team to fix in coming weeks or in coming games, and they might have strategized around this already. So you never want to bet on partial games. I rarely bet on individual players. I do a little bit on the Super Bowl, and that's it. My bets are primarily money lines and spreads. You can do over-unders as well, although personally I'm not a fan of those. The other important thing to know about good betting strategy is you don't want to stress return on investment. You're happy with any return. You don't necessarily need to bet the money lines that are plus 500. You can if you really believe in them. But this idea of you're going to bet $100 to win $500
16
is not necessarily
10,
the best play.
19.
Sharps bet minus 400 money lines all the time. These would be games where one team is favored by 9 or 10 points.
7, 9.
And we bet those money lines because those are basically sure things. Now, yeah, you have to bet $400 to win $100, and that doesn't
15.
sound like a great deal. And if you're not paying attention, you get a $500 check at the end of that, not a $100 check with a $400 loss. You'll get your original amount back that you bet, plus you'll win $100 on top of it. So These are the kind of lines that you think, okay,
9,
well, these aren't really
4,
great
15.
bets because you have to bet so much money to win so little money. But these are ones that you basically can't lose. So it's a really good opportunity for a betting strategy to play certain money lines that you feel very, very confident in, regardless of what the return on investment is.
10,
Here are some more tips
3,
that I've picked up throughout
19.
the years. Every week, I include one high return wager, which is worth 10% of one unit, on a parlay or a teaser. So these are the kind of things that if, let's say I have $100 units, I'm going to bet $10 on a teaser. And why? Because if I do a 9-team teaser for 6 points or something like that, and it just so happens to hit, I'm going to win
13. Dealer but
maybe
player
50
wins.
to 100 times my initial wager. And this is the kind of thing where if you lose a lot of against the spread
10,
bets, but you
9,
happen to hit on
19.
this, it's huge. And I think that it really
12. Dealer but player wins.
It's covered my losses more than once, and it's actually been the difference between winning and losing weeks in a
9,
couple of situations,
10,
and it's also made winning
11.
weeks
Checking for blackjack.
just outrageous. You know,
Dealer
if I
does
do a
not have
$10
blackjack.
parlay on, let's say, 7 or 8 teams, that has like a 300 to 1 return. And I've won $3,000 on returns of a $10 bet with this. So, yeah, they're hard to win, but they really, really
12.
go the extra distance. And it's not like you're making a very big investment with
Bust.
those. Like I said, if you have $100 units, which means that you're investing $10,000 over the course of a year, a $10 unit is nothing. So this is 10% of one unit, which is 0.1 multiplied by whatever your unit value is. So not a lot of money here. Another good betting strategy is you need to invest multiple units on strong bets. So there are people out there who will play, you know, this for 1 unit, this for 1 unit, this for 1 unit. That's an okay strategy, but you're only going to do as good as your record is. The better play is to do 5 units on one bet, 5 units on another bet, and, you know, maybe 1 or 2 on a third. And this way, those 5-unit bets are really, really strong. And if they hit, then you've doubled your money, regardless
5,
of what happens with that
10,
third game that maybe you're
11.
not so
Checking for
confident.
blackjack.
Remember,
Dealer
you're
does
only
not
playing
have
a few
blackjack.
games.
12.
And you can invest a huge amount of your money in
Bust.
every week. Because if you figure you have a 50-50 chance of getting it right, that's what the spread is supposed to do. You should be
4,
receiving at
10,
least 50% of your
12.
money
Checking
back,
for
if not
blackjack.
more, if you're betting well.
Dealer does
So
not have
investing
blackjack.
multiple units on strong bets is the way to go.
8.
As a general rule, you want to play more underdogs than favorites. We talked about this a lot in the last video series, so I think I've hammered this point through. You also want to ensure
Bust.
that the majority of your plays are not public plays. You want to not necessarily be playing strategically anti-public, but you want to make sure that you are betting the majority of your teams with the sharps and not with the public. This is the final video in our series, and I apologize if it seems like it's a little all over the place, but I wanted to get in my best advanced betting strategies all into one video so that you have everything you need to know about sports betting in the back pocket for when it comes time for you to finally go up and make your first bets. So these are advanced betting strategies, mostly related to NFL football, but that can be applied across the board. Let's talk about home teams versus away teams. Home teams and away teams are kind of an interesting thing. If you ever play in survivor pools or in office pools, you'll notice that home teams are always the
Excuse
pick.
me, are you Jesus Cock Lover 69 on Christian Mingle?
Home field advantage is huge in sports.
Tried anybody else to help me get it, pull it
here's
out?
kind of
Would you
some
like to
ways
help me
to
pull it
think
out?
about betting if you're planning on betting
I haven't
either
been
the
to
home or
Disneyland.
the away team. First of all, home teams should be favored by 3 points if both teams are equal. That's sort of the standard go-to football experience, is that if you have 2 teams that are equal in every way, the home team should be favored by 3. So that might help you kind of determine how books feel about the different teams. If you notice a home team that's favored by 1, you know they think the other team is slightly better than the home team. You should also know that divisional games are often played a lot tougher than non-divisional games. You see two teams that have a rivalry, like let's say the Steelers and the Browns. If one of those teams is just terrible, chances are that they're going to play really well against their rival because that's a game that sort of defines their season. You know, there's a number of instances where one team is playoff bound, the other team is not, but the rivalry between these teams is strong because they're a divisional rivalry. And you'll see that the terrible non-playoff team can actually win the game straight up against their playoff-bound opponents because to them, this is their Super Bowl. This is their one opportunity to sort of end the year on a positive note, and they're going to put absolutely everything into that game. So you want to be aware of that when you're playing divisional games. Huge spreads in divisional games are ones that I jump on all the time. If I see a team favored by 7 or more in a divisional game, it almost doesn't matter to me what I do. It's not necessarily a high return investment for me, but it's something that's paid off so many times in the past that I'm almost automatically designed to like that sort of spread. You also want to be aware of teams that are traveling long distances, particularly West Coast to East Coast. Those teams are often thrown off by the time changes. They're used to playing in games that are 4:05 Eastern Time. Suddenly they're playing in a game that's 1 o'clock Eastern Time. To them, that's almost like playing a football game at 7 o'clock in the morning. And it means they have to wake up extra early. They have to deal with the different weather conditions from coast to coast. And it's something that can really kind of throw a wrench in the plans of a lot of those teams. It's an important thing to pay attention to. And what I like to do in that game is play the team that's not traveling. It's generally a better play. You also want to be aware of legendary stadiums. Qwest Field in Seattle I've already mentioned. It's the loudest stadium in the NFL, and other teams find it nearly impossible to go in there and win. Arrowhead is another great example where the Kansas City Chiefs play. It's a stadium that just has this sort of mystique about it that makes it incredibly difficult for visiting teams to go in and get the win. The non-obvious play is usually the best play in sports betting. If you think about two defensive teams coming together to play a football game, nobody expects them to score a lot of points. And so sportsbooks know this. You know, they are smarter than the average bettor. So if they see two teams with super strong defenses coming together that have, maybe average offenses, you want to play the over in the over-under pool. And the reason why is because everybody in the world is going to play the under. It's going to be the public play. The number that the sportsbooks have designed is done so in order to kind of entice people to bet on the under and to lose that bet. So if you see two defensive teams coming together to play a game, the over is usually the better play. And it works exactly the same way with two high-powered offensive teams. If you have two teams that have tremendous offenses and terrible defenses, you still want to play the under because the number that the sportsbooks will have decided for the over-under is going to be higher than normal, and it's going to be a number that is statistically unlikely to occur. One of the other important things to do when playing the non-obvious is to play the underdog in double-digit spreads. So if you see a team that is favored by 17 or 14 or something like that, you definitely want to put a bet on the underdog because those 17 and 14 point spreads are very difficult to cover. And also, again, if the team wins by 10, it still feels like a blowout to them. So you might see a team get up by 10 and then stop trying because it's not up to them what the spread is. They don't know or care. They just care about getting the win by any means necessary. So there have been a number of times where I've seen teams go up 35-0 in the first couple quarters of the football game and then sit all their starters and watch as the other team comes from behind, scores 17 or 18 points, and actually manages to cover a double-digit spread despite the fact that they were down huge early in the game. So non-obvious plays are often the best plays. One other big opportunity that you can take advantage of is a look-ahead game. What happens is very good teams have a tendency to look ahead of poor opponents. It's just something that you can't help, really. You know, if you are a playoff-bound team or a team that's kind of on the cusp of the playoffs, and you know you have a game coming out against a terrible team, like let's say the Oakland Raiders or the Jacksonville Jaguars, but your following game is against the Patriots or another really good team, you have a tendency to overlook the poor team and not really prepare as well for them, not really get as psyched about playing the game, because you're looking ahead and saying to yourself, well, in 2 weeks we got to play this really tough game that's going to determine our entire future. And if we can't win that game, we're in big trouble. And you just sort of start to not pay attention to the team that you're facing this week. Look-ahead games are kind of a really interesting phenomenon in sports betting. And if you see a team that is playing against a really poor team, should be an easy win. But that team is looking ahead to a future week, you might often find a lot of value in playing a wager on the underdog money line. Many of these games that are look-ahead games are just straight up lost outright. This is where a lot of winless teams will suddenly kind of come into their own and get a win. They'll look really good doing it because they will have prepared tremendously to beat this playoff team or to beat this, super strong team, while the other team hasn't hardly prepared at all because they're too busy worrying about the future. So when I see a look-ahead game, I bet heavily against the spread, and I make a small wager on the underdog money line because that will help cover losses in other games or losses in previous weeks, or it will just put me way ahead. The look-ahead game is a really important thing if you can identify them. That's all I have for you. I've now given you all of the lessons that I've learned over the